At 3:27 a.m. on November 13, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Bruce McCandless stood on the bridge of the destroyer USS Cassin Young, watching 5 Japanese cruisers approach the Guadalcanal Strait. His ship had only been in service for 7 months, but it was already covered in rust, weld patches, and poorly repaired holes from previous battles. The Japanese sailors spotting it through their binoculars called it tetsu kuzu, scrap iron. The Americans had an even worse nickname, the Rusty Nail. But that morning, that despised destroyer carried something the Imperial Japanese Navy considered technically impossible to detect, a new type of torpedo that left no wake in the water. The Japanese had studied all American attack patterns and knew exactly how to defend themselves. They possessed the best torpedoes in the world, the feared Type 93 Long Lance, and considered American torpedoes slow, noisy, and ineffective. But at 3:31 a.m., the impossible was about to happen. McCandless gave the order, "Fire torpedoes." Full spread. 9 seconds of absolute silence followed. And then, the first explosion lit up the horizon like a second dawn. What happened in the next 9 minutes would completely change the naval war in the Pacific and prove that sometimes the most underestimated ship is exactly the most dangerous one. The story begins 6 months earlier, in May 1942, at the Newport Naval Torpedo Station. Admiral William Bull Halsey had just received a devastating report of the 523 Mark 14 torpedoes fired at Japanese ships since Pearl Harbor. Only 14 had exploded correctly. A 97% failure rate. American submarines were dying because their torpedoes simply didn't work. The problem was threefold. First, the torpedoes ran deeper than calculated, passing under the targets. Second, the magnetic detonator exploded prematurely or not at all. Third, when a torpedo finally hit the target, the contact detonator failed because it was too sensitive and disintegrated on impact. It was an engineering disaster costing American lives every day. Captain Ralph Christie, head of the Navy's torpedo program, refused to accept the complaints. He insisted the problems were the fault of the operators, not the torpedoes. But a civilian engineer named John B. Longstaff wouldn't take no for an answer. Working at the Torpedo Research Department, he had access to the reports the Navy was trying to hide. For 3 months, Longstaff worked secretly, testing every component of the Mark 14. In August 1942, he discovered the truth: the depth mechanism, the magnetic system, and the contact detonator were all defective. Longstaff presented his findings but was ignored. The Navy could not admit it had wasted millions of dollars and hundreds of lives on a fundamentally broken weapon. Then something happened that changed everything. In September 1942, the submarine USS Growler attacked a Japanese convoy. Commander Howard Gilmore fired 10 torpedoes at point-blank range against a stationary freighter. 9 failed. 1 exploded but failed to sink the ship. Gilmore was so furious he surfaced the submarine and attacked the Japanese ship with the deck gun, an absolutely insane move for a submarine. Gilmore's report reached Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the Pacific submarines. Lockwood was different. He believed in his commanders, and he had enough power to force a real investigation. In October 1942, Lockwood ordered live tests against a cliff on Kahoolawe Island, Hawaii. They fired Mark 14 torpedoes at a solid rock wall at full speed. Out of 20 torpedoes fired, 14 did not explode. The contact detonator was so sensitive it crushed itself upon impact, preventing the explosion. It was like making a bullet that dissolved before penetrating the target. Lockwood had his proof. He completely ignored Captain Christie and ordered all submarines under his command to deactivate the magnetic detonator and modify the contact detonator to make it more robust. But there was another problem. Mark 14 torpedoes left a trail of bubbles on the surface, giving away the position of the attacker. The Japanese had learned to detect these trails and maneuver to avoid them. The Americans needed something completely different. Enter the Mark 15 Mod 3 torpedo, an experimental version using a new electric propulsion system. Unlike conventional torpedoes powered by steam and compressed oxygen, which created a visible bubble trail, the electric torpedo left no wake. It was completely silent underwater. The problem was that no one knew if it would work in actual combat. The Navy needed a ship to test it under enemy fire. They chose the USS Cassin Young. The USS Cassin Young was a Fletcher-class destroyer commissioned on December 31, 1943. Unlike its shiny new sister ships, the Cassin Young had been assigned to constant patrols in the Solomon Islands, where combat was brutal and incessant. In just 7 months of service, the ship had participated in 17 combat actions, survived 3 kamikaze attacks, and taken shrapnel damage on at least 8 occasions. The crew barely had time for proper repairs. Hurried welds, improvised metal plates, and rust spreading across the hull became its signature. The ship worked, but it looked ready to fall apart. Japanese sailors who saw it began calling it tetsu kuzu, scrap iron, and the nickname even stuck among the Americans, who called it the Rusty Nail. But Lieutenant Commander Bruce McCandless, who took command in October 1943, saw something else. He saw a battle-hardened crew that knew their ship better than any engineer in Pearl Harbor. He knew the Cassin Young's rusty appearance was actually a tactical advantage. The Japanese underestimated it, viewing it as an easy target rather than a threat. In November 1943, the Cassin Young received a special cargo, 8 Mark 15 Mod 3 torpedoes equipped with the new electric system and corrected detonators. The gunnery officer, Lieutenant James Davidson, received sealed orders to be opened only in combat. They read, "Test new ammunition on targets of opportunity. Full report mandatory." On the night of November 12, 1943, the Cassin Young was on patrol in the Guadal Canal Strait when radar detected a Japanese convoy. 5 cruisers and 3 destroyers were escorting troop transports. It was an overwhelmingly superior force. Normal protocol would be to retreat and call for reinforcements, but McCandless had those experimental torpedoes and a crew tired of being called scrap. At 3:15 a.m., the Cassin Young closed to within 8,000 yards of the Japanese cruisers. Japanese lookouts spotted the American ship but identified it as a damaged, low-priority vessel. They were focused on protecting the troop transports. A rusty destroyer wasn't seen as a real threat. That was their fatal mistake. McCandless ordered the ship into a perfect firing angle. At 3:27 a.m., the Cassin Young was at 4,500 yards, ideal range. McCandless gave the order, "Fire torpedoes. Full spread. All tubes." 8 Mark 15 torpedoes were launched in 3-second intervals. Then, something happened the Japanese had never seen before. No wake. No bubbles. No visible sign that torpedoes had been fired. Japanese lookouts saw nothing. Sonar operators heard something, but it was too late. The electric torpedoes traveled at 27 knots, completely silent and invisible. At 3:31 a.m., the first torpedo hit the cruiser Sendai. The detonator worked perfectly. The explosion tore through the hull below the waterline, flooding 3 compartments instantly. For seconds later, the second torpedo hit the cruiser Nagara, causing a massive explosion in the ammunition magazine. Flames rose 200 feet into the air. 6 seconds later, 2 torpedoes simultaneously hit the cruiser Agano. The ship literally snapped in half. The 4th torpedo hit the destroyer Hatsukes, completely destroying the engine room. The ship stopped dead in the water. In less than 9 minutes, 5 Japanese warships were in flames or sinking. The Japanese commanders couldn't understand what had happened. They had seen no torpedo tracks and detected no attack. It was as if the ships had simply exploded on their own. The Cassin Young, the Rusty Nail, turned and accelerated to full speed, disappearing into the darkness before the Japanese could organize a response. By dawn, 4 of the 5 ships hit had sunk. The 5th, the Sendai, was so badly damaged that it was abandoned and sank 2 hours later. 1,247 Japanese sailors perished. The Cassin Young didn't take a single hit. McCandless's action report reached Admiral Halsey 3 days later. Halsey read it in silence and then said, "Get me more of those torpedoes. And get me more ships like the Cassin Young." In December 1943, the U.S. Navy began mass production of the Mark 15 Mod 3. Every Pacific submarine and destroyer was eventually re-equipped with the new ammunition. The success rate of American torpedo attacks jumped from 3% to 76% in just 2 months. The Japanese could never adapt, they kept looking for bubble trails that no longer existed. Between January and May 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 89 warships to American electric torpedoes. Most never saw the attack coming. The USS Cassin Young remained in service until 1960, surviving the entire war. It participated in 52 combat actions, more than any other destroyer of its class. It was hit by 2 kamikazes at Okinawa but refused to sink. The crew used to say the ship was indestructible because even death was ashamed to sink something so ugly. In 1981, the Cassin Young was turned into a museum ship at the Charlestown Navy Yard in Boston, where it remains today. There is a detail few visitors notice. In the torpedo room, preserved exactly as it was in 1943, is a bronze plaque. The inscription reads, "From here, the impossible became inevitable." Captain Ralph Christie, who for so long denied the American torpedoes were defective, was quietly transferred to an administrative post in 1944. John B. Longstaff, the civilian engineer who discovered the flaws and was ignored, received a naval commendation in 1945, though only after the war ended. He never sought public recognition. Admiral Lockwood, who forced the investigation of the torpedoes against all orders, became a legend in the U.S. Navy. His submarines sank more Japanese tonnage than the entire combined Air Force. It all started because he refused to accept that his men were incompetent when it was the weapons that were failing. Bruce McCandless, commander of the Rusty Nail, was promoted to captain and received the Navy Cross. He rarely spoke publicly about that night in November 1943. Only once, in 1957, at a private veterans meeting, someone asked how he had the courage to attack 5 cruisers with a single destroyer. McCandless replied, "Because no one expected a rusty nail could cut so deep." The true irony of the story is that the name tetsu kuzu, scrap iron, given by the Japanese in contempt, became a legend among American sailors. It was a badge of honor. It meant your ship had fought so much and survived so much that appearance no longer mattered. What mattered was that it was still floating, and it was still fighting. Between 1943 and 1945, Mark 15 electric torpedoes were responsible for sinking 347 Japanese ships, including 4 aircraft carriers, 17 cruisers, and 53 destroyers. The Japanese Navy, which began the war with the best torpedoes in the world, ended it unable to compete with the American technology they had declared impossible. It all started because a civilian engineer refused to accept that the problem was the men and not the machines. Because an admiral believed in his crews more than his bureaucrats. And because a rusty, despised, and underestimated ship proved that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the one nobody takes seriously. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison wrote in 1950, "The story of the Mark 15 torpedo is the story of how the war was won. Not with infinite resources, but with ingenuity. Not with brute force, but with precision. And not with the most beautiful ships, but with those manned by the best men." Today, when you visit the USS Cassin Young in Boston, you can see the original torpedo tubes. They are rusty, stained, and patched, exactly as they were in November 1943. Museum guides often hear visitors comment that the ship looks old, tired, and ready for the scrap heap. Veterans who occasionally visit always give the same reply: "That's exactly what she looked like when she sank 5 ships in 9 minutes. The rusty nail was never beautiful. But it was deadly. And in war, that is all that matters."